So welcome everyone. This is our I think it's our third critical conversation seminar. So for those of you who haven't yet been to one, the Fall 2020 Critical Conversation Series will explore the context of the prison and policing systems in New Jersey and the work of advocates to transform our approach to public safety and justice. Each seminar will tackle a different aspect of the profound and wide-reaching impact of the carceral system on society through expert analysis and firsthand testimony from directly impacted speakers. Through these conversations, we hope to provide both space for conversations reflecting on how this context can inform our work inside and outside of facilities, as well as concrete actions we can all take to change this context here in New Jersey. So some of the contributors, we formed the NJ Prison Engaged Network event contributors. So we have the PD Green program, Princeton Spear, TCNJ Spear, and PrEP. And thank you so much to all of our funders and partners. These include Campus Conversations on Identity, the Carl A. Field Center for Equality and Cultural Understanding, the Pace Center for Civic Engagement, Princeton Progressives, Princeton University Department of Spanish and Portuguese, Princeton University Program in American Studies, and the Prison Teaching Initiative. So just to go over the agenda for today a little bit. So right now we're doing welcome and introductions to our speakers. Then we will have presentations by our speakers, and then we will have an audience Q&A. So for that, you can put questions in the chat or you can just unmute yourself. And we'll follow it up with some action steps so that you know how you can get involved. And at the end, we have a little survey for you to fill out so we can get feedback from you. So just some Zoom etiquette. If you please turn on speaker mode, but remain muted until the Q&A session, and only then you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. But feel free to drop any questions you might have for the speakers in the chat throughout the presentation, and we'll get to them at the audience Q&A portion. So just a little background on today's event. So today we are talking about solitary confinement. So on July 11th, 2019, Governor Murphy signed into law the Isolated Confinement Restriction Act, which restricts solitary confinement to a maximum 20 consecutive days or 30 days total over the course of 60 days. It prohibits the isolation of vulnerable populations, including individuals who are under 21, over 65, seriously ill, pregnant, identify as LGBTQ, or have mental or physical disabilities, and requires the DOC document and publish data on the use of solitary confinement. This bill is the direct result of years of persistent advocacy by survivors of solitary confinement with the NJ Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. Although the law went into effect on August 1st, community members monitoring the regulation and implementation process found serious deficiencies in both the administrative law and lived reality inside. So just to introduce the speakers we have today, we have Ron Pierce. He's the inaugural Democracy and Justice Fellow at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. The fellowship, which is awarded to an advocate who has been formerly incarcerated, focuses on restoring voting rights to people with criminal convictions. Ron is a frequent commentator and lecturer on issues related to voting rights, re-entry, and the human rights of the incarcerated. His writing has been published in NJ Spotlight and Truth Out. Ron graduated from Rutgers University, Newark, summa cum laude in 2018 and was a recipient of the Vera Institute Scholarship. Our next speaker is Christopher Smack. He is currently a Mountain View student at Rutgers University. Chris has spent 7 years in New Jersey State Prison, having experienced solitary confinement in the process. He is currently producing a short film documenting what it is like to be incarcerated from an insider's perspective.
All right, Kylie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kylan. I'm going to be moderating today. So we decided to do a little Q&A kind of situation going on, so we can get right into it. So Chris and Ron, can you guys share a bit of your story with the audience, please?
Yeah, go ahead first, Chris.
Sure, gladly. So my name's Chris. I'm from Camden County in New Jersey. Nice little suburban town, a little paradise right outside of Camden, about 5 minutes away. Um, I was in and out of jail when I was younger because I was exposed to pharmaceutical drugs in my town at a relatively young age. I became addicted to heroin at the age of 18. So I made the rounds of going to rehab and county jail, and you have the same kind of things constantly drilled into your head. You know, memorize these slogans, pray for sanity, abstain from all drug use, or you'll go to jail and or die. So to an addict, this isn't really a practical means of help, nor does it offer very much hope. I went to prison for 7 years when I was 25 for trying to rob somebody with a knife. During my time I spent incarcerated, I really got an up close and personal look at the way the system works in there. They pretty much operate on the slogan that you do the time, or you do the crime, you do the time. There's a primary focus on punishing negative behavior, but that doesn't really provide all the resources one needs in order to really get help. So sometimes somebody might need help to do a little introspection or decide to maybe turn their life around. There needs to be a greater focus on healing. That's here really what I'm primarily to focus on in just my prison reform work as a whole. I believe that punishing crime without addressing the root causes of it only helps to perpetrate the revolving door cycle, which is the American prison system. We live in the land of the free, yet we have a higher rate of incarceration than any other country in the entire world. So instead of providing people with the help that we need, you know, we throw them away until their time's up, and then they continue their cycles because they're not really getting the help that they need a lot of the time. For me, solitary confinement is just one prime example of the current crime and punishment method that's practiced in New Jersey state prisons and prisons all over the country. I spent a very brief period in solitary confinement in state prison, although they wouldn't dare call it that, but that was only for 3 days. I had a longer experience in solitary confinement while I was still in the county jail before I had even been convicted of the crimes that I had been arrested for. So basically guilty until proven innocent and all that. I went for something I didn't do. Basically got hit, or not even hit, but more just shoved in on the tier. I didn't put my hands on anyone. I kind of just fell backwards, and that was all that happened before, you know, all the cops rushed in and the sirens were blaring, and I ended up doing 15 days in solitary confinement for basically something that I didn't really even do. And if you'd like me to get more into my personal experiences of that 15 days, I'd be more than happy to, but you know, or I can just give Ron the floor for now.
Well, I'll start off just by saying that I did a little more than 4 years in solitary confinement overall. By today's definition that the bill has, I would have done all 30 years because I was actually in maximum security prison for the entire 30 years that I did time. And maximum security prison still does not allot you today 4 hours outside of your cell. So one of the things that we want to talk about is the solitary confinement and the breaking of the mental capacity that it breaks down, because it's not so much a physical torture as it is the mental torture. And so I talk about one time specific, although there was many different times that I can talk about. So the one time specific, I'm going to tell you, I went in the hole. Now, unlike Chris here, I did get in a fight, and in maximum security prison, you're not going to do 30 years and not get in a fight. Let's be realistic. You got to survive, and so I got in a fight, and I went to the hole for 30 days and ad seg for 9 months for this particular time. And while I was in the hole, there was two people, one on either side of me, that had been mentally broken so badly that one thought he was in the cell. Now you got to remember, it's a single occupancy cell, and the guy was in the cell thinking that he was in a cell with his girlfriend, having a fight with his girlfriend, throwing himself against the wall. And this went on for hours at a time. And it was more entertainment for the officers than them trying to stop it so he wouldn't hurt himself. But he had been mentally broken. And he may have had troubles prior to that. I don't know the man. And on the other side of me was a man who thought it was a good idea to paint his cell with his own feces. That's how much he had lost his mental faculties. So when they found this out, because he kept his light out, they had to extract him, which is another topic of we'll get into at a different topic. But they removed him. They had somebody go in there and had them basically clean his cell, and then they put him back in. But now, because of the fact that they had to extract him, they had to write a report. So now they had to keep an eye on him. Now they had to have a 24-hour watch on him, which means his light had to stay on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So the officer could sit at the door and look at the slit of a window so they could observe him. But his light was attached to my light. And so every time I try to get to sleep with the light on, I put the pillow over my head. But if anybody knows anything, you fall asleep, your hands get loose, the pillow falls off your face, the light goes back in your eye, my eye don't close. Up awake I was going. For the last 5 or 6 days, I got very little sleep. So I was really cranky and I was really edgy, which is what solitary is designed to do. It's designed to make you that way. So after I got out of the hole, they sent me upstairs and they stuck me in a cell. Now this was February on the corner. Now it's only a cinder block building. It has no insulation, has no nothing. And it was freezing. The walls were freezing. I had every bit of clothing on that they allowed me to have, which wasn't a lot. And I was under every cover I could be under. And I was freezing so bad I couldn't get to sleep, which brought me more anger and more anxiety. And then somebody came by that I knew. He was somebody I knew in high school when I was playing football. And he came by, he was a social worker, and he just wanted to help. So as he came by and he asked for if he could do anything, I exploded in a rage on him. And to this day, I really wish I could meet him again and apologize to him. But I exploded in a rage, and you could see the fear in his eyes. And he ran from the cell and he left the wing. And I didn't see him after that. I don't know if he even quit what he was doing, whatever, but I never saw him again to tell him, look, that wasn't me. That was just a rage inside of me. That was just something inside of me exploding. So that bothered me more than the time in hole or anything else. That bothered me, and I really couldn't get no sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about him. And when I woke up the next day, I looked in the mirror. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw and the mirror is another joke. When I looked in the mirror, I saw somebody not only didn't I like, I wouldn't have been friends with me if I met me on the street. So I had to figure out how I could ever get myself in that position where I could be such a moron that I couldn't stay out of jail in jail. No, and that started a transformation. But it wasn't because of the ad seg time. It was in spite of it. I did not want to become the people that were side by side with me. I needed to get myself together, and I needed to get myself into some kind of focus where I could transform myself, because they weren't going to do it. And that is ad seg torture. In a nutshell, it breaks your mind until you either explode in rage, which 90%, I'll talk about the history later on, but 90% do, or you make sure that you're not going to be the person that you don't want to be.
If it's
All right.
okay, before we continue, would it be okay to just share my personal experience, because a lot of what Ron said really resonated with me, especially given the fact I only did 15 days. It's to do years I couldn't imagine being put. I was put in a cell. You have your metal sink and your toilet combination, the standard. There's a double bunk in the room, but no cellmate. It's just you. um, I had to go to court throughout this whole process, not just the court inside within the jail for trying to prove my innocence of why I was put in solitary in the first place, but I was fighting my case and I was going back and forth in court. And I was in solitary confinement when they took me there. So I'm already not in my right mental faculties. Like Ron said, I was doing everything I could do to make sure that I didn't lose my mind in the brief period I was in there, because I'm telling you right now, I was depressed. I had more anxiety than I ever had in my life. And I was basically, which is a whole other story, but when I went to court, my public defender wasn't even my public defender. He was covering, right? He was covering somebody's shift, which is just insane to me. But after I took that 7-year plea deal, I had to get escorted back to solitary confinement. And I can say that's really the only time in my life that I seriously considered killing myself. And here I am at 25 years of age, knowing that this is a temporary situation, but being so mentally drained and broken only after, what was it at that point, 12 days, that now I'm looking at the ceiling thinking about, how can I hang myself? Whereas I've never had a thought like that before that moment. So there's a lot of root issues that really need to be addressed here.
Wow, thank you guys for sharing that. So I guess that gets into that kind of like was a nice lead into our next question, which is how did solitary confinement originate and evolve? And what lessons might this history hold for prison reform movements today?
Well, I'll try to take on how it how it began, where how it originated and all, and then I'll let Chris take on anything else he wants to. But in 1829, an experiment of solitary confinement in the United States began at Eastern State Prison, or Eastern State Penitentiary, and that term is important, in Philadelphia. But the Quakers believed, and that's who started, the Quakers believed prisoners would be in isolated cells with only a Bible, and they were isolated stone cells, by the way, with only a Bible, would have time to repent. So you were doing penance, so therefore penitentiary. But by 1890, the Supreme Court had found a considerable number of prisoners after a short confinement fell into semi-fatuous conditions, and it was next to impossible to arouse them. Others became violently insane, and others still committed suicide. So while who stood an ordeal better were not generally reformed, and they very rarely could recover their full mental faculties. So it was known in 1890 that this was a means of torture. Now in New Jersey, the current form of isolation, solitary confinement, started in 1975 to gather people that were part of the civil rights movement, anti-war protesters, prisoners, those that may have committed further crimes than just protest. The prison staff decided that they needed a management control unit, which is what they called it, MCU, management control, because they wanted to make sure that political prisoners would not be able to form political awareness within the prison. And so they started MCU. MCU went to further things, but we won't get into that. I'll let Chris talk about the rest of the evolving matter.
Thank you, Ron. I really appreciate it. For sure, this has been an institution that's over 150 years old and has not really changed from its inception. Like you said, Ron, one of the main ideas behind it was to reflect on your poor behavior, your bad behavior, and to reconcile your sins with God. And very much was my experience when I went to solitary confinement. I wasn't allowed any reading material except for a Bible that I happened to have in my possession, and I'm not even particularly religious. So I read it anyway because what else are you going to do in there? They're like you said, Ron, over 150 years of staff reporting the mental torture, the trauma, the anxiety, that there's physical ailments that people are going through. So if this has been going on for 150 years, you would think that there would have been a little more progress so far. There does exist a scholarly consensus that states that there are psychological effects from solitary confinement that are seriously harmful to people. So not only is this not right and is this not helping the individual correct their behaviors, but now if you want to look at it from even a more selfish point of view, the people who aren't fully on board with this idea, there's a public health risk. You're locking dangerous criminals up, you're throwing them in the hole, and then they're being released back onto the street. So that's really not good for anybody. But it really just makes us realize, or makes me realize, that there needs to be much more of a focus on therapy and some kind of access to resources and counseling and social workers. Imagine, being held in what amounts to an isolation tank for years on end. You have people hurting themselves, losing weight, getting headaches, losing sleep because we're using a system that's outdated, that doesn't work, and that causes more harm than good. And I just think that it should be noted that the entire legality of this practice is constantly thrown into question in the United States. There's a lot of lawyers that argue that it's a direct violation of our Eighth Amendment rights because solitary confinement has been designated as, quote, cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. And that's been international law that's been said. And yet we still implement it here in our own country. So I wouldn't look at very much of an evolution of the practice of solitary confinement in and of itself, but more so of just a modernization of it to fit the current structure. A lot of obvious solutions come to mind for me. Less of a model of who did it, tell us who did it. That's all they care about. They should be asking the question, why is this kind of thing happening in the first place, and why does it keep on happening? Isn't that the core principle of corrections and rehabilitation? We really need to ask ourselves, where's all our taxpayer money really going? It's just funding this money pit of a revolving door where it's so expensive to house just one inmate. But I'm getting off track. My entire point of saying this is throwing somebody in isolation because they did something wrong is slapping a Band-Aid over an open wound. And before you heal a wound, you need to tend to it. So these solutions these practices they have in place aren't really solutions. They're just causing further problems.
Definitely. I think that leads into our next one too, which is just what does solitary confinement look like in New Jersey? And to second that question, I guess, is what terminology and categorizations are used to describe isolation?
Okay, solitary confinement. What does it look like? Looks like this, and the mattress is probably not that thick, but the steel thing that's underneath it is that hard. That's what it looks like, and you're in there 23 hours a day with nothing. A couple of books if you're managed to be able to get them. What it looks like in terminology and categorizations is in in certain prisons, you have certain solitaries. Now you have the whole, which, by the way, all of these are old terminologies and they just retermed them, and I'll let Chris get into the reterming. I'll just tell you what they were because all they did was change some of the things. But you have the whole, which is what we're talking about, 15 days, 30 days. They call it disciplinary detention, or they called it disciplinary detention. They have another name for it now. You have administrative segregation. So if you break an infraction rule, you go to the whole, from the whole you go to ad seg, or administrative segregation, for a period of anywhere from, now the whole you could only get up to 30 days, 15 days for one charge, 30 days multiple. For ad seg, you can get up to, for a non-asterisk charge, which means a petty charge, you can get up to 90 days in the whole, in ad seg. For anything with an asterisk added to it, you can get up to a year for each count. So that's the two punitive ones. Then you have the stigma, which is Security Threat Group Management Unit, which is any organized group that is not authorized by the Department of Corrections. And they call it the gang unit. And some organizations in there are what they call gangs, but some are not. Some are political based groups that are just being defined that because they can be, because what the rule for it is 2 or more people gathering to conspire to commit an offense against the public policy of the prison. That's the definition of why you go to the gang unit. So then you have MCU, which is Management Control Unit, which I spoke on earlier. Management Control Unit is anybody that can, and this is from a book called Inside Out, 50 Years Behind the Walls of New Jersey Trenton State Prison, former guard Harry Kamisi. And he says, the guys are singled out for the MCU were viewed as potential troublemakers or political leaders who need to be segregated to keep them from influencing the rest of the population. This was a new and controversial concept in New Jersey. The unit isolated activists and leaders from the prison's general population as an attempt to psychologically reshape their convictions by subjecting them to an extraordinary level of physical control and sensory deprivation. That is from a prison guard. That's not even from me.
So sanctioned torture, basically. Let's make this person's life so miserable so as to shut them up and to discourage anybody else from following in the footsteps. One of the reasons, solitary is implemented and should never be. Like Ron said, if you have 2 or more people gathering for any type of progressive stance or change or anything that goes against the official policy of the Department of Corrections, you are inciting a riot, and you will face disciplinary action for sure. Even the guys that go to the COs, the correctional officers, and say, hey, I'm entitled to a shower. I was just outside working out. I get a shower now. No, you get laughed at, you get moved to a different tier, a different prison, you get shuffled around. There's no change wants to take place in there. Now, like Ron said, I experienced what would be referred to as the whole, I guess, in the county jail before I was even convicted of any crime. Just basically for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So 3 a.m. I'm getting breakfast. You get 3 trays a day. You're losing weight. It's ridiculous. And from there, I went to administrative segregation, which Ron described ad seg, and it's different in jail than in state prison, but it's the same premise of, you did something that goes against what we want, we're locking you away. It's punishment. It's just the crime and punishment model. There's really no other thought to it. Bad behavior gets punished. Be good. It's not always quite that simple. You have mental health units that on the surface you would think are designated in order to provide aid to people with mental health issues. Maybe somebody's suicidal, maybe they have slight anxiety, maybe there's a plethora of things we can all think of, right? That people deal with on a daily basis. But God forbid you tell them that you need mental health, because that's just another isolation unit where they throw you in what we call a turtle suit, which is basically a giant onesie. You have no privacy. You're in a two-man cell, but with three other people. So that's four of you. I hear people kill themselves back there sometimes. So all kinds of, you have to deal with the sights and sounds and smells of it. Just would not be fun. So I'd rather do solitary confinement than that. I was told when I went to solitary confinement, I would have access to mental health services, but I can't tell. Even if you are considering some or hurting yourself, any kind of, you're feeling a little depressed, you can't tell them that, because you're just going to end up in an even worse situation. So you got mental health, you got ad seg, you got the whole, you got different, they call whatever, there's different names for these different forms of isolation, but they're at their root, they're basically all the same thing. And then, like you said, you have STG, which is the gang unit, and SID, Special Operations Division, and they don't care. They just, oh, who's the big homie? Who did what? Who pushed that guy? Who hit that guy? And it solves no problems. I understand their reason for doing it is to get so-called troublemakers out of their prison, but what are you doing? You're sending them to another prison in another box where nothing is changing, and the same things are just going to keep happening. It's all really ridiculous.
All right, so I think you guys kind of touched upon the next question, which was how do isolation and related practices serve to repress political activity and organizing? You guys kind of talked about that already, but if you have anything more to add, definitely do.
Just one quick thing is, it was started because there was a lot of discourse in the country in the 70s, just like there's a lot of discourse now. So we must always remember to look to history to see how they're going to act in the future, or how they're going to act in the moment. And the MCU was mainly to shut down dissidents such as the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, and other organizers that were trying to organize such the same thing now as Black Lives Matter. They were just trying to organize to get the rights of that should be afforded every human being. So we must look at that to make sure we don't let that be repeated. Now, we do have this bill or this law that took effect, and I know we'll get into that in another question, so I won't speak on it at the moment, but we must remember that is this. So we must look at the 70s to look at what's going to happen if we don't keep our eye on a prize.
Well said. Yeah, I completely agree. We have to look at the historical events taking place and the reasons for it and learn from them, instead of just perpetrating the same kind of thing under a different name. Even just, not just people that are trying to band together to get basic inmate or basic human being rights for everybody in prisons, but there's, right before I left prison, I've been home for just over a year now, and right before I came home, they had a whole banned books list that was posted on every single tier in every prison, and it was pages and pages long of all these books that we weren't allowed to have for some pretty ridiculous reasons. Don't let them catch you reading the new Jim Crow. Like, you're out of there. Your ass is grass. It's just they really, the structure that's in place, and it just reminds me of pretty much the rest of the world, that powers that be want to remain in power, and they need these structures in place in order to do that.
It's so interesting. Really like how you brought that part up. That was very eye-opening, you guys. So for the next one is can you tell the story of the movement to restrict solitary in New Jersey? And how did directly impacted activists organize and build the coalition statewide?
Ron, I think you'd be better equipped to take that at first, seeing as how I'm just really starting to get involved.
Yeah, well, wow, this is not an easy topic, not because I wasn't there, because I was part of that coalition, but maybe because I don't want it to sound like I was doing anything that others weren't doing. But basically, Amos Cali, Justice Roundtree, and others formed an organization called NJ Cake. Now, cake was CAIC, so it's not like you eat cake. It was basically against solitary confinement, and they partnered with ACLU. They partnered with New Jersey Institute for Social Justice long before I was even out of prison, let alone part of it. And so, but as we started coming out and started using our voice, they reached out to people that were formerly incarcerated, and they asked us to help them to make it a human story rather than an abstract story. Now, this is important because when you look at something in an abstract, it's hard to take it and understand what its real impact is. But they asked us to do this thing on the radio. I forget what it's called, Green Space or something like that. And so we did this dialogue, and it came out really, really good. And Nafisa was really powerful, and Mark was powerful, and so is a lot of the others that were part of it. But it spoke about the isolated confinement, what it does in the reality. And it, like Nafisa talked about her time when it was that time of the month for her, and she needed a tampon, trying to ask the guard, which is embarrassing enough, while she was in ad seg, trying to ask him for something of a woman's product, and him telling her, use toilet paper or use a sock. I don't care. You're not getting anything from us. You don't have it, too bad. So and speaking about how you have to, and she went through a detailed thing about trying to go to the yard and the process of being strip searched to go out to a caged yard, and then getting strip searched to come back in from that same caged yard, and the dehumanization process there, the process where I talked about making sure that you had a routine so that you didn't lose your faculties, and even though they were going to disrupt your day anytime you went and did something in your routine outside it, and so as we told these stories, we got some traction, we got some political process going through, and then we testified before the bodies of the legislators, and we actually moved some legislators that were against the bill to voting for it, and it ended up getting passed. And then the governor was really scared. He did not want to sign that bill, but he was pressured by so many people that needed that bill to go forward, that he signed it in private, and then he just let us know he signed it. So now it was a law. So you can move when you use real life over abstract. You can change the narrative, and that's what's needed now in all aspects of criminal justice reform. We must change the narrative, and I'll stop there because I know we're getting kind of long-winded.
Thanks, Ron. I mean, right after I came home from prison, I moved up here to Middlesex County. That same week, I was at that reform panel, I believe hosted by Spirit Princeton, and I remember hearing the FISA speak, and Mark and you and everybody else, and it was just really the emotional impact of it. I cried. It was very personal, and it really, I think it kind of maybe opened some people's eyes to the reality of the situation, that these are actual things happening to actual people when it's really so counterproductive. So, I go to this event. The next thing I know, a few months later, I'm hearing about this legislation getting passed because of you guys, because of Ron, because of Spear, because of my friends and my roommates and these guys I was in prison with. It's really amazing to me. And I think it's just really important to hold this space. It's important to hold a safe place in order to discuss these thoughts and ideas and experiences with each other, because this is how we start to organize. And if there are people here that are care about affecting positive change for whatever reasons they have, we need this kind of space, and I'm grateful for it. I mean, say I wanted to do this, but I didn't have this group of people, this community available to me, what would I do? Especially being on New Jersey State parole. Am I just going to ruffle feathers and make waves and possibly get myself sent back? So I just want to reiterate how important it is to hold meetings and to hold spaces like this.
Yeah, that's amazing. So good job to you guys. So how is the Isolated Confinement Restricted Act limited? I know you guys have a lot to say about this one, so let's get into it.
Go ahead, Chris. I'll let you start this one. I've been starting way too many of them.
I appreciate it, because I think you're probably more of an expert than me anyway, but I'm more than happy to share my 2 cents. I think that the act itself, it's a good start. It's something. It's momentum in the right direction. It might not be all of what we had hoped for, which I'll get to in a moment. But like Ron said, sometimes you just have to compromise, especially in politics, right? The problem with me, the problem with the act is that solitary confinement still exists, and there are still ways, like Ron mentioned earlier, to circumvent these rules, especially when you're working in an enclosed prison system and not necessarily having the most scrutiny from outside eyes. There are workarounds. Another restriction I would say with this act is, so the act states that as of August 1st, 2020, people in New Jersey state prisons can only spend a maximum of 20 days consecutive in solitary confinement, as well as a total of 30 days within a 60-day period. So basically what this means is that somebody could, like 30 days of a 60-day period, that's half of the year. So somebody could potentially spend almost half of their sentence in solitary confinement, just going back and forth. And 20 consecutive days, I personally know, and I wasn't even in that bad of a mental state when I went in, that's more than enough to affect somebody's well-being. Me being a person with slight anxiety and drug dependence issues, but no real mental health history, I seriously considered suicide after a few days because of my situation of taking my plea deal and so forth. It's definitely a step in the right direction. I can't even speak that much on it because I wasn't personally involved, and I really only know what I've read about it online. But I'm really proud to be a part of a community that has been responsible for putting this law into New Jersey state legislation. I'm just I'm amazed by that.
Now, the 20-day thing, one thing you must know, that the United Nations has declared any more time than 15 days consecutive in a solitary environment is considered torture. So 20 days is 5 days of torture. So we still have torture in New Jersey. even though the way the implementation is they're only doing 15 days of whole time at a time. And they, but by the way, they changed the name, so it's not considered disciplinary detention now. Now it's restrictive housing. See, so now it's not the whole, it's restrictive housing. When they changed it from the whole to disciplinary detention, it wasn't the whole, but it's still the whole. It's still, you're going in there with nothing. You're going to get a shower once every 3 days. You're not going out to out of that cell except for a 5-minute shower, which you're going to be handcuffed and shackled while you shower. You know, so, and you're going to be naked walking down the tier because you're not going to be allowed to bring clothes with you. This is the whole. This is what it is. So anyway, it's limited in ways that it has to be monitored, and it has to be monitored carefully because the people that have to institute it really don't want to. They really fought for it to be changed so that it wouldn't. And they really, in the beginning, what they said was, it doesn't even exist. You're making laws to things that we already do, which was not true. It's still not true. And the law should have taken effect August 1st, and we're monitoring it now. And that's when I think somebody will get into Prison Justice Watch asks later on. But we're monitoring it now as best we can, and we need help. But as it stands right now, the limitations are less in the wording and more in how are we going to make sure it's implemented? How are we going to monitor its implementation?
Definitely. Thank you guys for sharing that. So the next one is, how have you shared your own public testimony or personal narrative to contribute to movements for the prison reform / abolition? You kind of touched upon it, but.
Well, I started out as a justice studies student in the prison, and when I got parole, I told everybody that I wouldn't forget them, and that when I came out, I would work toward change. So when I went to, I was in a halfway back program, and I went to register to for Rutgers. I met a person, an amazing person named Regina Diamond Rodriguez. And she showed me how that people that are likewise minded, the people that are formerly incarcerated, can help people that are coming home. She knew just what to do because she's been through it. So that kind of lit a spark. And I'll give you a story I give just to show you the thought process that needs to change when people come out, and why I started using my testimony and how I still use it today. But we would walk in to go register because we had to go to a different building, and I saw 2 squirrels scrambling around on the ground and run up a tree, right? So I told her, I said, wow, look at that. Look at squirrels fighting, because I hadn't seen squirrels in decades, you know? And I was just fascinated. Look, 2 squirrels fighting. I said, no, they're not fighting, they're playing. And it's just that mindset, like everything in prison's a confrontation. So I started thinking, wow, she was able to make me see that everything out here isn't a confrontation, just in that little thing. And so when she introduced me to that, I started wanting to testify, to say things. I had written 7 articles, and you said Truth Out before, it's actually Truth Dig. So I was published in Truth Dig for 7 articles, and that was my start in being able to tell my story. And then And then Chris Agins asked me to speak here and he speak there, and so I started to see that my speaking, right, and believe me, I was nowhere near accomplished in it at all, but they had faith in me. But I started to see that my telling my story had an effect. It was able to start changing it, and so when I was able to land an internship through the Mountain View program, through NJ Step, with NJ New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, I was able to say, yeah, this is what I want to do. And then the voting rights came up, and that's a whole nother story I won't get into because we're talking about solitary. But so I knew that was my calling, so to speak. And I've been doing it ever since. And hopefully I'm getting a little better at it and I could change more.
Thank you, Ron. For me, I have to be honest, this is my first event that I'm actively participating. I got involved, basically, it just happened. I came home. I live in Highland Park, which borders New Brunswick. So the people that live in this house, it's owned by a church. They charge really cheap rent for us, the criteria being men coming out of prison who are going to Rutgers or who are going to school. Immediately, I knew one of the guys that lived here because I did a lot of time with him. We did our whole bid together, and he took me to the solitary confinement critical conversation. I believe it was another critical conversation panel at Princeton, and it kind of just lit this fire under me. And I kind of, especially after that legislation got passed, it was really eye-opening to me more than anything, because I was like, wow, here are guys that I know personally that are really affecting real change. And it never fails to amaze me. So there's a lot of things that I want to do. So having a community of like-minded individuals who are not even only for prison reform, but just for positive change societally as a whole, I think it's just such a positive thing to be a part of. And for me, it gives me a channel, an avenue in order to make, to help affect the kind of change that I want to affect, especially when it comes to solitary confinement.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing that. So we have one more question on our behalf. So it's, what does solitary confinement in New Jersey look like during coronavirus, and how is solitary being used today?
Well, I could only speak on what other people in the prison system have reached out and told me, not having been in prison during Corona, and very, very scarily so. I have a friend, he's 70 years old, and I'm going to tell his story because his story compels me to push for compassionate release, which just got signed today. But going back to, so he is 70 years old. He is suffering from Agent Orange complications. He is blind. He has Parkinson's disease. So he has to go to the doctor's hospital every now and again for treatment. He has several different ailments, and he's not doing well. But so every time he goes to the hospital, he has to get tested for corona before he leaves. He has to get tested when he comes back, and then he has to be isolated for 14 days in a solitary confinement unit. He goes for treatment once every 2 weeks. So he's been in solitary confinement on and off since Corona happened. And here's a man who's did 35 years in prison. He is one of the most decorated Vietnam veterans in the state of New Jersey. He did 25 long-range missions into Cambodia when we wasn't in Cambodia. and he did 17 major combat operations. He has a Silver Star. He has all sorts, and one of his problems is he has PTSD, which was a contributing factor in his crime. But here is a guy on the last whims of life who has done more than 35 years in prison, is a model person as far as those that are incarcerated. He teaches, he helps people as a mentor, and he is stuck in solitary confinement just because he has to go to medical every couple of weeks. And one other person relayed to me is they went to they had to go, has to get insulin. So he has to go every day to get insulin. Now, when people are being brought in for COVID, they get put in a holding cell to go to medical. The same holding cell as the people that have to take insulin. They're in, and now they have masks, which is, I guess, something, but they were in there every day with people that tested positive for COVID. And this is something that they were just telling them, you either go in that cage and wait your turn, or you don't get your insulin today. Not getting your insulin is like a death sentence. But going in that cage was like a death sentence in the early parts of COVID. So this is what solitary looks like under Corona, as far as I could tell.
It's understandable that in the wake of a pandemic that nobody really saw coming, we didn't realize the full implications of it. So it's understanding that there's going to be a period of adjustment. That being said, there's no reason anybody should ever be forced to be put in a holding cell with somebody else who tested positive for coronavirus. You're not putting that person only at risk, you're putting the entire state of New Jersey at risk at that point. I'm really grateful, Ron, that you shared your friend's story, because again, I was released a year ago, so I only know of what my friends are telling me that are still incarcerated about the changes. But I know that the use of solitary confinement has actually increased since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in order to help stop the spread of the virus, like Ron said. So if I have to go for a medical trip, I'm getting tested before I leave. When I come back, and I need to wait the 2 weeks in case symptoms don't show up until then. So if I have treatment every 2 weeks, like Ron's friend, I'm spending half of my time now in solitary confinement. Surely there's another way to do that. Maybe have a tier, a temporary COVID tier. So people who test positive or people who need to go out of the jail for medical trips can have a space where they don't need to be in isolation all the time. There are measures, there are things that can be implemented rather than just throwing them in a box by themselves. This whole measure really, I think, needs to be called into question. People that are confined to live in prisons are already isolated as it is, even without being held in solitary confinement. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, those of us on the outside have experienced to some degree, right, what it's like to be isolated. Now imagine what it must be like for somebody that's locked up, who you're doing your time, but you're only allowed a certain amount of time on the phone each day. You're getting one visit a week usually at the most. Most people don't get anywhere near that. You're confined to a small 8x10 cell all day, and you're not leaving that cell unless it's time for your shower, to go outside, to go to school, or to go to work. That's pretty much it. It's that 23 in 1, 23 hours in, 1 hour out. It's more or less the common practice across the state of New Jersey from what I've seen. You can go outside, which is so important, but even then you're fenced in. So there's still that degree of isolation. I'm not saying that it's unbearable, but it's there. But if you factor COVID-19 into the equation, you have guys that are locked up that are going to solitary confinement and they didn't even do anything wrong. You're no longer allowed to have outside visits from your friends and family due to the pandemic. This is creating more isolation. Yeah, recreation times being reduced, contact with anyone's kept to a bare minimum to help stop the spread of the virus. to a degree, that's all very understandable. But to implement this higher use of solitary confinement as a way to combat the virus is just ridiculous. My thoughts on the matter is that if you're going to send, instead of sending people to solitary confinement during this time when everything is already more restrictive, it's hard on all of us. It's hard on everybody that's involved in this whole system. You got families, people that work in the prison. We're all people, right? And people are being punished for no reason. How about, here we go. Here's the little prison tablets we get, right? We hook them up to a computer right on the tier, you know? Josh can tell you, he's seen us running around with those things. How about using them to provide us with, a healthier, more pragmatic approach to help prevent the spread of COVID-19, right? Send us things on our tablets, provide us with face masks on day one and hand sanitizer. How can we stop the spread? How can we have access to counseling, family contact services, homework assignments that we're now not getting, addiction recovery education, immigration support, how to get registered to vote when you're released, how to enroll in college? Why is none of that information available on here? Why can I only play stupid games and that's it, and get emails and pictures on this thing? Is that really, it's great. I'm not gonna lie, it helps a little bit, but come on, there are surely there's better ways to be doing this. You got people in solitary confinement for 14 days going on a medical trip. Now the only contact that they're getting is put your hands behind your back and you feel a CO's hand maybe with gloves on, putting handcuffs on you. Like, that's real affectionate, right? So it's just this whole system is very counterintuitive to me. And I know there are so many better ways. These are just ideas I'm just coming up with. Imagine if a group of us got together, sat down, really put pen to paper with solid ideas and brought this like Ron and like others and like all you guys have done before. It doesn't have to stop here. If there's enough pressure on the governor to change the law, you best believe they want to get reelected. They're going to change that law.
Thank you guys so much for, answering those questions. I think that you really did a good job laying out it very clearly for all of us. And I guess we're going to move into our Q&A from the audience. But before we do that, Jill Knapp, can you say a couple words? Putting you on the spot here.
Thank you. I just wanted to say hello, Ron. Hello, Chris. You suffered my math teaching for years, and I'm proud to know you.
Love you, Jill. Thank you.
No suffering with you, Jill. You make math very interesting.
It is,
Thanks, Jill. All right. If anyone has any questions in the audience, you can pop them in the chat now and we can start reading them.
Can I ask a question, just verbally, rather, since nobody else is writing one down?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So when you're in solitary confinement, your interaction with other people is so minimal, and it's pretty much with the correctional officers. Is there any sort of relationship that you can form with some of them that just create sanity, or is it all just being treated by contempt for them, or is there some in between? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but no, I wouldn't ask him for anything other than what I'm supposed to be given. And even that, I try not to ask him, because they are there more or less to make sure that I stay in my cage. They are there to make sure that I am not allowed to think of myself as a human. So, and so I never really, not that I had any ill will toward them. They did their job, and that was their thing, but I would not have befriended or had any kind of dialogue, because what's the first thing an officer of any law officer tell you the first time they're grabbing you and under the first arrest? Anything you say can and will be used against you. Now that term sticks hard in my brain, so it actually deters you from being able to interact with any authoritarian figure. And when you're in the prison system, you are in an authoritarian government-run authoritarian base. So no, I never did, but that doesn't mean others haven't. People will do a lot of things to survive. I just chose to exercise differently.
Like Ron, I had a very similar experience. I didn't really interact with the guards, the mental health, anybody that came around, because I knew that there was really no point, because you're not going to benefit from it in any way. It can only hurt you or be neutral, so it's not worth it. And on the flip side of that same coin, trying to forge relationships with other people who are in solitary confinement with you is not the easiest thing to do. It's not for the fact that, well, for one, you're separated. Yeah, maybe I can talk through the vent, but that's only to the guy that's in the room adjacent to mine. And if he doesn't want to talk, then I'm not talking to anybody but myself. There is, at least my experience in the county jail, was there was a lot of malice. There was a lot of, it was very loud, screaming constantly, threats of violence constantly, towards myself included, from people I didn't even really know. And it really makes me think, are these people just violent, or are they angry about something else? Or how many times have they been locked up and thrown in the hole at this point? I know what being locked up does to people. I've experienced it. Like Ron said, you're gonna learn how to fight. You're gonna have to do certain things in order to survive. That's not who I am, but it's who you have to become sometimes. And even if I'm trying to forge a relationship with another person that's being held in solitary confinement, it's discouraged anyway. The prison guard or the correctional officer is just going to tell me to shut my mouth anyway.
All right, thank you, Sandy, for asking that question. I think that we have some more coming through the chat. So our next one is from Alessandra. Are people with mental illnesses put into solitary confinement? You're muted.
You're muted,
Ron.
Ron.
I'm sorry, I had that chat on, so when I hit this button, it just ran like the line over. But yes, people with mental illness are put in solitary. There was a time when it was prevalent, that it was so prevalent that they had a routine for people that were badly getting worse and worse mentally ill. And they would go to the hole for something. They would be disruptive in the hole because they're incapable of controlling their emotions because of the mental illness. So they would get in trouble in the hole, and they would be put in what's called a dry cell. Right now, a dry cell is nothing. Doesn't have any running water. It doesn't have any way. It has a hole in the wall, right, for you to relieve yourself in. It's got a concrete slab, and they give you a mattress at 11 o'clock at night and come back at 5:30 in the morning and take it. But that's all it has. If you want water, you have to call and you have to beg the officer to get off his chair to come over and give you a glass of water. So they would go from the hole to this dry cell. They would finish their time out in the hole in a dry cell, right? They would take them to Ad Say, and in 1 or 2 days, the guy would act back up. They bring him in the hole. This cycle, I worked as a paralegal for years in Trenton State Prison. And this was so prevalent that when you worked court line for a month, you would see these guys 4 times. And it was the same guys. It was the same charges, it was the same officers charging. And it was the same cycle. So we started well, actually, George Jocks and Lloyd Johnson started a lawsuit to try to get them to get psych evals prior to being charged. And that turned into a consent decree years later, CF versus Terhune, it was called. And that consent decree, now I worked in a law library, so I worked a little bit on it, but it was mostly George Jocks and Lloyd Johnson who worked on it. And they understood it because both of them were long timers. Lloyd Johnson spent about 18 years. Lloyd Johnson spent about 18 years in Marion before he came to Trenton. So, and George Jocks created the Inmate Legal Association. So they were well versed in what they were doing. But they created this system, this lawsuit, and what the consent decree said was, from now on, before a person can be, and that didn't say you couldn't put them in hope, but before they could be adjudicated guilty, they had to be seen by had to have a psychological evaluation, and if they were part of the psych eval said they weren't in their right mental state, they couldn't be charged with it, and it helped a little bit, but what it made is it made them make an isolated confinement unit for mentally handicapped people. So they isolated them from population, so they couldn't be a danger to the population. Even though most of them were no more of a danger to the population, they were more a danger to themselves. So yes, and this, the bill, the law as it stands now, says you can't stick people with mental health issues. They are part of the vulnerable populations, so they can't be stuck in any kind of isolated confinement. However, going back to the bill and the law, solitary confinement or ad seg, which is what they would have been going into now, right, was transformed by putting a different sign on the door to a non-isolated confinement. And all they did was change the sign. So they're still going into it. It's just now they can't go to the hole.
Yeah, it very much happens, like Ron just said, it's against the law to do it, and it happens. And you might have people with underlying mental health issues, or they have mental health issues that you just don't know about because they're not documented in the paperwork, because for fear of retaliation, or if I go to a social worker and they ask me my mental health history and I'm incarcerated, if it's not perfect, you think I'm going to let on that it isn't? Absolutely not. So you have, of course, Jill, you remember, I think it was my very first class that I took in prison, and I was thrown into the hole, like my first week in class, for something I hadn't even done for 3 days. Luckily, the paralegals were bringing me my math homework, but maybe they don't know if I had any mental health issues or not. You know what? The guards that put me in that cell actually told me, oh, you're lucky. This is the cell where that guy just hung himself and killed himself a month ago. And joking about it like it's funny, like, oh, you're in the haunted cell. Like, first of all, it's not funny. And second of all, if this is what's happening, don't you as a human being care? Don't you care about that man's life? I already spoke on the mental health unit in the county jail that I was incarcerated in. It's its own form of torture. It sounds way worse than anything I've ever been through, way worse. You have guys that go on suicide watch in Garden State Correctional Facility, the main prison I was in for most of my time. That's in the infirmary, in the medical wing. It's under video surveillance 24/7, but these people are isolated in a room by themselves. These are people that expressed that they may be suicidal or whatever is going on with them, that they've been put on suicide watch, and they're completely isolated except from guards and a nurse maybe bringing them some kind of Thorazine or some kind of pill to help them sleep 20 hours a day. So there's no treatment, and there's a time limit on that too. I'm not sure how it works, but I used to go to medical all the time and see on the computer screen where the CO would sit, there'd be a guy. About the only thing he couldn't see was where the toilet was in the room. There's no privacy. There's no help being offered. It's just isolation. And what is it really doing to people?
All right, thanks for answering that, guys. Okay, here. We have another one from Devin. What if there are any situations where people choose to enter solitary, is the situation the same as those who are sent there for punishment? And then what kind of alternatives would you use in an ideal world?
Okay, he's talking about what's called voluntary protective custody. Yes, you can volunteer to go into an isolation unit. No, it's not going to benefit you. It's the only thing that it benefits you is it takes you out of any immediate threat that might be to your physical self, but you're going to sit in any kind of isolation unit. The movement is limited. The interactions with human beings is limited. And if you go to voluntary PC, the officers are going to really abuse you because they're gonna make an example, because they don't want you to have an easy time. They want it to be difficult. But, and I don't want to, let me rephrase that, because not all officers are like that. But there are enough to where that's the way it always feels. So that's the way you have to always deal with it. But yes, you can volunteer to go to protective custody, but no, you're not going to get any more benefits than anybody else gets in a solitary confinement unit.
I have a friend. He actually just came home from a parole violation. Now, this friend I met while I was in prison, he lived across the hall from me. Got pretty close with him. Good guy, great guy. Was there because he had drug issues. Definitely a little crazy. I'll tell him that. I'll tell anybody that he's a little crazy, but he's a good person. And he chose to go to solitary confinement because he felt as if he was already there. The prison I was in for 6 years before I got transferred was, like I said, if you didn't go to work or school, you're stuck in that cell with another person, which can be just as bad as solitary sometimes. Just imagine, even your best friend, it gets old. To him, he needed a change from the monotony of doing nothing all the time to get sent from one box to another. So he did something that got him in trouble. They gave him like 750 days ad seg time. This is before they changed the law. He was actually in ad seg when they changed the law. He only ended up doing, I say only, 270 days. And I'm receiving letters from him during all this. And he's in Northern State Prison, the administrative segregation unit, the punishment unit. And he's telling me in these letters he has much more freedom and peace and happiness than he ever had in the prison I was in. He was allowed to have a television. He had all these channels. So to somebody, it might be seen as a reprieve from the monotony of what basically is an isolated environment to begin with. What kinds of alternatives would I use in an ideal world? There are a lot, but I think the main focus has to be on healing. Like I said before, why are these behaviors continuing to happen? Why do they exist in the first place? Every person is an individual. Every person has their own history, their own experiences, their own mind. There needs to be a much more of a focus on mental health and access to mental health treatment, access to counselors, to social workers, to one-on-one therapy sessions, to really get to the root causes of what's going on. A person shouldn't have to be locked up 5, 10, 20, 30 years to learn a lesson on their own that maybe it's not always easy to ask for help, but if these services are just automatically available to people who are incarcerated, maybe we wouldn't have to keep sending the same people back to prison time and time again as a punishment to remove them from society, instead of just maybe helping them a little bit.
Yeah, we
Definitely.
should practice more restorative than retributive. And we don't, then maybe we don't need the prisons at all.
My point exactly.
Definitely. I think we have one more question. Not sure that I entirely understand, but are any educational programs provided to inmates who have previously been in solitary confinement after they are released into the general prison?
Well, as I stated earlier, I did somewhat over 4 years in solitary confinement units. And I also was part of the NJ STEP program and graduated, got my my associate's degree in prison and started my bachelor's degree in prison before I made parole. So to answer your question, yeah, you can get schooling afterwards. NJ STEP in New Jersey does not discriminate against you having a record or whatever crime you committed. They just are there to get as many people educated as possible. And I want to just say two more things. One, the education is a key to lowering recidivism. There are a lot of keys. Education is among the top one because it helps you critically think rather than react. And the other thing is, somebody once asked me when I was fighting this isolated confinement issue to try to get the law, how did you survive solitary confinement? And the answer I gave them, and the answer I'll give you is, who said I survived? Who said I came out without damage? Who said I came out the same? I didn't. You cannot have those isolated incidents of torture and torment and come out without the scars that they live. There are things that happen in my life, even today. I'm home 4 years and I haven't been in solitary or in a punishment unit since the 90s. But the reality is I still suffer. I still, to this day, cannot walk in a room without making sure I could find all of the exits and be within reach of having unfettered access to that exit. I cannot do it. I'm home 4 years. So no, nobody gets out alive, you might say. We all come out with damage, and PTSD is real for people coming out of prison, especially those that suffered long terms of solitary and long terms of isolated confinement, because it is the nature of the beast.
It's so true. I'm just now starting to realize I'm having things pointed out to me a year later, whereas at first I thought I came home and I was fine and I adjusted, and which is true, but you don't realize the psychological and traumatic toll that being locked up has on you sometimes until after the fact. Looking back, I can say that sometimes I say things and I don't even realize, and it's not that I'm glorifying any aspect of being incarcerated, but it got to the point where you have no responsibility. You're told when to eat, when to shower, what to wear. It's all very uniform. You don't have to think. Meals are provided for you. Housing is provided for you. It got to a point where once I got into my own single cell, I was way too comfortable. I was offered to go to a halfway house. I declined for that reason. I'm now home and I'm having things pointed out to me. If I'm hanging out on my front porch and somebody walks by or a car goes by, it doesn't matter who I'm talking to or what I'm doing. I have to stop and look behind me because I need to know who's driving down my street, because I'm so hyper aware of everything that's going on around me, because I felt that I had to be for 7 years. And I only spent 15 days of those 7 years in isolation. Well, maybe closer to a month, but it's, or like Ron said, I need to know where the exits are too. I can relate to that. I have to sit with my back has to be against the wall. All these little things. I need to be able to see the exit. I like to be in the corner all the way in the back or close to the exit, nowhere in between. It's weird, man, and I don't get it, you know. But to go back to I just think it was really important to touch on that, and I'm really glad you did, Ron. Yes, educational opportunities are available for people who coming out of prison, coming out of solitary, going into prison. They're there. It depends on what prison you're in, and it depends on who you know, and or if somebody even made you aware of this opportunity in the first place. I was very lucky to know people in the New Jersey Step College program that got me in relatively quickly. But not all prisons have the same access to it. You know, certain ones do, some don't. Some prisons have a lot of trade programs and even some arts, music and all that. And some prisons have almost none of that. So it really just depends. But, you know, having a program like New Jersey Step as a good example of just having people come into the prisons, let everyone know, like, hey, this is free college. This is what it is. You can do it if you want. It really was transformative for me. I had no plans upon my release. I got my associate's degree. I was going to chill with that and just do nothing. And who knows what I was going to do. And it's because of somebody that's actually in this meeting right now that talked to me. Josh, it was you. And you sat me down and you were like, man, listen, you have less to risk by continuing your education. And just by being around that kind of support and by being around other people who were trying to learn and who had a thirst for knowledge and a thirst to change, and these teachers that came in were just amazing. That for me, education, it sounds cliche and it might even sound like fake to some people, but I can't stress enough, like having access to that education was probably the number one biggest thing that helped me to grow up and really helped me turn my life around.
Thank you guys so much for answering all of our questions and all of the audience questions. It's been awesome to hear from you guys. I think Amanda's gonna move into the action steps to just talk about how people listening can get further involved in everything that you guys are talking about this far. So Amanda, if she's here.
Sorry, yeah, give me 2 seconds to share screen. Oh, that's the end. Gotta go back. Well, first of all, I just want to say a massive thank you to Ron and Chris for everything they shared today, and especially for your final words, but everything that you're able to bring to us this whole time. We are so grateful. We know this is a really painful thing to talk about, and we are so grateful that you are really using your voices, as you said, to make this change. Chris, I'm glad this could be your first opportunity, and I think it went fantastic, so you can rest happy with that. And we can't wait to have you back for more even later. So we just wanted to make sure that before we head off, we leave you with a couple ways that you can get involved, that if you heard these stories, and I can't imagine how you can hear these stories and not be moved to action, there are a couple of very easy steps that you can take. So earlier on, Ron briefly mentioned an organization called New Jersey Prison Justice Watch. And it's sort of the rebrand of NJ Cake, because there's more issues than just isolated confinement to work on, of course. And so essentially it's an organization made up of community members, activists, and directly impacted activists who are working for the dignity and the human rights of every incarcerated person, both inside and outside, and after incarceration in New Jersey. And so if you want to learn more about them, you can absolutely connect on social media with any of the accounts. And also, if you want to join the listserv, which is the best way to hear about what's happening and get information on all the meetings and how to get involved there, which they're all virtual now, so pretty easy to access. You can email this email here, and that Crystal will get you right on the listserv. And then they said the next step, if you want to get involved a little bit more, is you can write letters to the editor about these issues, about solitary confinement, isolated confinement, what you heard here today. You can respond to a different issue that's in the news at that specific time. And we have if enough people are interested, and you can express interest in the exit survey or responding to my follow-up email, which will include all this PowerPoint and more information. if you respond saying you're interested, but you want some support, if we get a critical mass, we should be able to schedule a little letter writing party, or be able to provide you with training resources so that you know where to go next. So make sure to respond and let me know if that's something that you're going to be interested in doing. And finally, if you're really passionate about this issue, want to get involved with the broader work that Ron mentioned is being done right now on these issues, the best way to do it is to join the monitoring committee. This is a group of New Jersey Prison Justice Watch that meets every week, and they talk about, okay, so this is what the law said, right? What's actually happening? What's the reality on the ground? And being that independent, it's really being that independent source of oversight for the DOC that up to this point really doesn't exist. And so this is where civil society is coming in and able to communicate and understand what's the actual lived reality happening in prisons, and what can we, regardless of what the legislation is, what's actually happening on the ground and what can we do about that. And they definitely need support. Students can definitely help out with lots of research. There's a lot of compiling of testimony to do. There's many ways to get involved. So if that's something, if you really want to commit to this work and join the effort, the best thing to do is to show up on Thursdays at 11. So with that being said, as always, it'd be fantastic if you all could just spend a couple minutes and fill out the exit survey at the end of this call, just so that we can have feedback, make sure we do better next time. But you can look forward to an email from us well, it's very soon. I know I've been a little late sometimes. I apologize on that. So I will get that out to you as soon as possible with this PowerPoint. So you have all of these links and can access them whenever you need them, and to be able to follow up. So thanks, Gab, for dropping the link to the survey in the chat. So thank you all again so much for being here. We really appreciate your fantastic questions, your time tonight, and paying attention. Also, a big thank you to our sponsors who make this all possible. Shout out to Sandy and Princeton Progressives who are on the call with us today. So thank you all for your support. And yeah, one last big thank you and applause for Ron and Chris and all the organizers who made this happen. So thank you so much and have a great night, y'all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who came out and supported us. It means so much.
And just for anyone that's still on the call, our next one will be on November 6th. So expect an email.
Okay, we'll do.
God, I always forget that. Thanks, Gab.